We have to show that we are ready to fight the sort of war that's being fought in Ukraine. And if we don't show that readiness, we will not deter Mr. Putin.
It's the NATO summit, and the question of when the UK can increase defence spending to 2.5% is being much discussed. The Labour minister was speaking to Rosie earlier, Jim McMahon. He repeated the usual when circumstances allow line. But if you wanted to know how shortages are affecting the armed forces, then worth looking at the Times front page this morning. The outgoing head of the Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, says the levels of ammunition supplies are classified, but if you knew the truth, they would put the hairs up on the back of your neck. He says we have 5 years to rearm to ward off a Russian attack. Let's speak now to General Sir Nick Carter. He was Chief of the Defence Staff until 2021. Good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, good morning. Thanks for having me.
How bleak is the position when you look at the current situation when it comes to armed forces, bearing in mind Patrick Sanders' comments?
Yes, just before we get into that, today the Tony Blair Institute is hosting the Future of Britain conference. And the reason I'm doing this interview is that I've got a conversation this afternoon with General McChrystal, who many listeners will have heard of. We are going to talk about the state of the world, what it means, and indeed try and provide a bit of advice for what this next government has got in front of it.
And there are things that can come out of that to do with AI, which I very much want to talk to you about in a moment. But let's get the sit rep as it actually is. Is it bleak? Is the British Armed Forces in a fairly parlous state?
And the starting point has to be that the global situation and the threat that our country and the NATO alliance faces is probably as bad as it's been since the 1930s. You know, I think for the first time we actually see a coalition of certainly three openly hostile powers in Russia, Iran, and North Korea, with China from time to time helping them out. And the fact that those three countries are cooperating in a way that we also haven't seen for probably over 100 years is deeply alarming. And I think that we need to start from the perspective of the threat being as great as it is. This is entirely recognized in Eastern Europe and obviously in Ukraine. And yes, I mean, are we well prepared and matched to that threat at the moment? No, we're not. It has to be the straight answer. And what General Sanders has said in the newspaper this morning is entirely accurate, I suspect. He's been closer to it than I have for the last couple of years. But if he's saying those sorts of messages, then I entirely believe what he has to say. And we need to wake up and smell the coffee.
Do we need to move on to more of a war footing? Because you're talking about the 1930s, the Second World War was on its way then. There isn't a land war in Eastern Europe. There is obviously a conflict in the Middle East as well. Do you think we actually need to start talking about ourselves, that we need to move militarily to some sort of war footing so we're capable in the next few years?
I think the starting point is that our political leadership need to persuade the electorate that actually we have a problem. And I think that, you know, it's sad that during the course of this recent election campaign, national security and defence didn't seem to be a dog that barked that much. But the electorate at the moment, I don't think realise how serious things are. I mean, obviously some do, but basic message is this is and wasn't a vote-winning issue and therefore wasn't discussed. And I think we've got to have a conversation about this so that people understand the nature of it. Talking about going on a war footing is very alarmist. I don't think I'd go quite that far, but those who are professionals and those who are responsible for managing the budget have got to persuade people to spend more money. I'm afraid that is the way it's got to be. Over the last 15 years, we've spent ever less money. There was one notable moment in the Defence Review of 2019-2020 when more money was spent or more money was given to defence. But in essence, the last 15 years have seen a period of managed decline, and that decline has led to the sort of hollowness that people are now talking about.
So what's the answer there? I mean, because the government said we had them on, we pushed them on this because we knew we were going to speak to you, we'd have pushed them on it anyway. They say they're committed to 2.5%. They won't say when. They'll say when circumstances allow. Do you feel it is 2.5%? Should it be more than that? Should they be more ambitious than that?
I mean, I think it's a big question, which I know that the new Defence Secretary, John Healey, is wrestling with, is how you spend what you have more wisely. And I'm sure that's a really good place to start from. But the answer is that a commitment to increased defence expenditure is a very positive commitment. We also have to be realistic that I think this government has inherited a very parlous financial position. And therefore, how they spend their money is going to be much more challenging than perhaps it was in 1997. So I do think that one has to give them some consideration to all of this. But I also know that they understand that we are in a very dangerous world, and that dangerous world is going to require us to think hard about spending more money.
Have we given too much to Ukraine? Have we correctly and legitimately said, we have some stockpiles, we will share them with you because you're in absolute clear and present danger and we're not. But has that left us underprotected? Do you think we've sort of given too much to Ukraine? Is it fair to think of that? Or by giving it to Ukraine, are we actually, in a way, fighting this war in the proper fashion?
No, I think he was exactly right to support Ukraine in the way that we have. And I think British support and British leadership over what the Western Alliance has done in relation to Ukraine has been notably impressive. And I think we need to continue to do that. No, I think what it tells us is that we've got to reinforce our own stockpiles. We've got to make sure that our defense industry is better able to mobilize in the way that Mr. Putin has mobilized his economy. I mean, when you think that he's spending, estimates vary, but maybe 40% of his GDP on the Ukraine war at the moment, and the fact that his ammunition dumps are full, the fact that his ammunition factories are working around the clock, 24 hours, we have a serious threat there. We need to make sure that we're not going to perhaps go to that scale, but we've also got to make sure that our defense industry is able to replace what we have given the Ukrainians and indeed increase our stockpiles.
You didn't want to say war footing, but you are, because you don't want to be alarmist, but you are effectively saying that, though, aren't you? You're saying, look at the country like Russia, they are at war, they are supplying themselves to that extent. We are nowhere near doing this. We've let our stockpiles run down. That sounds like we do need to get on some form of closer to war footing.
We've definitely got to markedly improve what our defense industry is able to do, and we have got to improve the readiness of our armed forces. That means that we're going to have to think hard about whether they're large enough, whether they're properly equipped, and indeed whether we care enough about them. And I do feel very strongly that that is something that has got to become part of the conversation that I think this next government will be prepared to lead.
The question, and you may not want to answer this for security reasons, but I am interested in this notion of, if we were drawn into a land war, could we fight one? If we were drawn into one of these conflicts that subsist, that make the world a dangerous place, the most dangerous since the Second World War, are we actually in shape to fight a war?
No, I don't think we are, would be my argument. We haven't had to do it for a very long time. And of course, when the Cold War came to an end at the beginning of the 1990s, there was a significant and understandable peace dividend taken. And then, of course, the sorts of engagements that we got involved in thereafter, whether it was in the Balkans and then the campaigns that followed 9/11, they were not war as such. There was a lot of combat and a lot of people lost their lives and so on and so forth. But it's not the same as fighting the sort of war that we see in Ukraine at the moment. And if we are going to, and this is the important point, if we're going to deter Russia from continuing in Ukraine, but then going on thereafter, if that's what Russia wants to do, then we have to show that we are ready to fight the sort of war that's being fought in Ukraine. And if we don't show that readiness, we will not deter Mr. Putin. And our behavior over the last decade or two has quite clearly not deterred him. And that's why he feels he can get away with what he's doing at the moment.
And if we're not ready for a war like that, there's no deterrent.
No, the plain fact is that deterrence is about having the necessary capability to be able to fight, but it's also showing that you've got the intention to use it if you have to. And I think that some of the messaging that perhaps the West has sent over the last few years has been messaging which has encouraged rather than deterred Russia's behavior.
We had a Ukrainian military advisor, an advisor to the politicians called Yuri Sak on the beginning of this program. And his concern, NATO summit, we're asking he's very grateful for all the support that the West has given. And I said, what difference could NATO do for you? And he effectively said, he didn't want to be too simplistic, but ultimately he thinks Ukraine should be given weapons to fire into Russia. And they should be allowed by their international partners to use the ordnance they get from us to fire into Russia, because by firing into Russia, they can stop some of these assaults coming. They can protect their own people. Now, there is a risk of escalation with that. What do you make of that as a notion? Should British or American or Western ordnance be used in attacks directly on Russia by Ukraine?
This is a difficult question because, of course, throughout the last 2 years plus of this war, Western policymakers have been extremely careful to manage the escalation that has occurred because they don't want to over-escalate, which then perhaps leads to a miscalculation, but equally might lead to Russia behaving in a way that we didn't expect. So it's a very difficult and fine call, and there are people who are much closer to it than I am. I think that it's right that the Ukrainians are now able to use the American ATACMS system, which is a long-range missile system with a range of around 300 kilometers. They seem to be able to use that against the depth of Russia's forces, which takes them I think probably outside the Donbass and certainly into Crimea. But there will be others who will judge whether they need to go further than that. And I think a lot of it depends upon whether the targets are available and what impact it'll have on the battlefield.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that we need to have a proper conversation as soon as we possibly can about what defeat and victory look like in this war.
And that means what sort of settlement there might be, if there is one.
Well, I think ultimately all wars will end in a conversation, and this one I probably will as well. The reality is that we have to help Ukraine get into a position where somebody will be prepared to compromise. But the question comes as to what that looks like, and that's not for me to judge, but others who are in power now need to make that judgment.
And later on today, you'll be talking about the role of new technology in the future of war as well.
Yes, I mean, I think we've learned quite a bit from what we've seen going on in Ukraine. And I think what we've learned is that the importance of, in warfare now, it's so much more a competition between hiding and finding. And once you've found your target, it's the speed at which you're able to hit that target. And so much of that is about software rather than hardware.
Yeah.
And of course, that takes you very quickly into artificial intelligence and all of the conversations that we've all been having over the last 18 months about the value of that technology. And of course, it's an extraordinarily valuable technology in military capability as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have to see how much it gets used and the difference it makes. Nick, great to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
That's General Sir Nick Carter, Chief of Defence Staff until 2021.
What we keep hearing is this: there is consensus that we are not ready to fight a war. Yeah. Whoever we ask, I mean, the front page of the Times this morning has this interview with General Sir Patrick Sanders, who says our armed forces are so worn down they were able to fight only a small war for no longer than a month. We haven't heard something that dissimilar just there. The question is, given that, what decisions do we make next? And on the messages, we're seeing sort of just the clear division in what happens. Di says, I can't believe people don't see the problem. There's so much unrest. Defence needs to be upgraded, not when the time is right, but now. We've got no navy, no ships, no strong army, no planes. But Michael says, give me a break. Russia can't even take a relatively small country like Ukraine, but now we're supposed to believe they'll take out the whole of Europe within 5 years. Don't give this any airtime.
Yeah, the idea of are we warmongering or are we just sensible is an interesting question.